There are men who build empires and believe that this makes them owners of the world. But there is something they never learn. The higher they climb, the less they are able to see what is right under their noses. The less they can touch, the less they can love without it feeling like a transaction. Richard Sterling was that kind of man, 52 years old, perfectly coiffed hair, with streaks of gray that his consultants said made him look trustworthy, suits tailored in Milan, a watch on his wrist that cost more than an entire family's home. He was in his office on the 23rd floor of a glass and steel building in Manhattan when he received his visitor. Luke, a business associate, walked in laughing at a joke Richard had told over the phone minutes earlier. Richard didn't stand up to greet him. He simply pointed to the armchair in front of his massive mahogany desk. "I want to show you something," Richard said, picking up the tablet that was always within reach. The screen lit up. "It's the most advanced system in existence. The latest model, implementation cost, $150,000. On the screen, there was a room, white, sterile, like a hospital room, except for the fact that it was decorated like a rich child's bedroom. There was a bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, a wardrobe, a shelf with carefully organized books, and on the bed, a small girl, with brown hair and skin pale as milk, sitting motionless. Sophie, 8 years old, Richard's daughter. High-definition cameras," Richard continued, sliding his finger over the screen with the satisfaction of someone showing off a new Rolex. "Two-way audio, monitoring of temperature, humidity, air quality, motion sensors, and this right here." He focused on a zoomed-in image of the face of a brown teddy bear, worn by time, with a slightly torn ear. "This is my masterpiece, an infrared camera hidden in the eye of Benny, her teddy bear. She never lets that toy out of her sight, so essentially I see everything she sees, everything she does." Luke looked at the screen, then at Richard. There was something in his friend's expression that begged for a question he didn't ask. "Security," Richard explained as if reading the silence. "Sophie has a rare immune condition, severe combined immunodeficiency. The smallest virus, the slightest bacteria, and she could die. Literally die. So this surveillance isn't paranoia. It's protection. It's love, Luke. It's love translated into technology." On the screen, Sophie moved slightly. Her hands caressed the teddy bear. Even through the pixelated camera, the tenderness in the gesture was visible. It was possible to see that the toy was her anchor in the world, her only friend. Richard smiled, a smile that held no warmth. On the ground floor of the mansion in Connecticut, 3 hours before this conversation, Mrs. Evelyn had stepped into the life of that place for the first time. She was 62 years old. The uniform they had given her was black and white, like that of an apparition. The instructions she had received from Richard's executive assistant were clear and repeated. "You are responsible for cleaning the private quarters, the home office, the master suite, and the girls' room. Under no circumstances are you to touch the child. No conversation, no interaction. You clean and you leave. If the girl speaks to you, you do not answer. Understood?" "Understood," Evelyn had replied, having spent 40 years of her life in professions that demanded invisibility. She knew how to be a ghost. Sophie's room was on the second floor. Evelyn had started with the master suite, that museum of luxury where Richard slept alone, because his wife had decided to live in Europe with the right therapist, and then climbed the stairs toward the girls' room. The door was white. There was a visible camera above it, and another invisible one somewhere Evelyn couldn't identify. When she entered, Sophie looked up from her book. The girl had that look of a flower grown in the dark, pale, delicate, yet still alive. Her eyes were big and empty in a way that only sad children can be empty. "Hi," said Sophie. Evelyn didn't answer. She followed instructions. She began dusting the shelves with mechanical movements. "What is your name?" Sophie asked. Evelyn kept cleaning, her heart racing. "My name is Sophie. I am 8 years old. Benny here." She held up the teddy bear. "Is 9 years old. I got him when I was born. Benny is my best friend." There was a sadness so deep in those simple words that Evelyn had to stop for a moment. She had to steady herself on the edge of an armchair so she wouldn't fall. "Can you talk to me?" asked Sophie. "Or are you going to pretend I don't exist too?" Evelyn looked at the girl. Those eyes. Good Lord, those eyes. She finished cleaning the room without answering, but as she was leaving, when her hand was already touching the doorknob, Evelyn did something small, something that violated everything she had been instructed to do. She took a paper tissue from her pocket. She folded it with fingers that had learned this art when her own daughter was 5 years old. A fold here, another there. And in less than a minute, she had created a small white paper bird. Simple, crude, but recognizable. She placed it on Sophie's nightstand and left. On the tablet screen on the 23rd floor, Richard saw everything. He saw Evelyn folding the paper. He saw her leave the bird. And he saw Sophie pick up that bird with a care that seemed sacred, as if holding something alive. Richard's expression changed instantly. The arrogance disappeared. The control disappeared. What remained was pure rage. Rage at knowing someone had touched his invisible territory. Rage at knowing his daughter had found affection in a gesture he had never made. His fingers trembled as he dialed his assistant's number. "I want to speak to this new housekeeper. Evelyn, now." An hour later, Evelyn was standing in the office on the 23rd floor. Richard didn't stand to greet her. He just watched her from across the massive desk, like a predator watching prey that had just stepped into a trap. "You received very clear instructions," he said, his voice as cold as the building's air conditioning. "I did, sir." "And you chose to disobey them." "I just left a piece of paper, sir. Nothing. You touched my daughter. Emotionally, psychologically, you touched her. And you did it knowing there were cameras. Knowing I was watching. You deliberately defied my instructions." Evelyn didn't answer. "My daughter is fragile, physically and psychologically. Any extreme emotion, any false hope could trigger a crisis, could kill her. Do you understand that?" "I understand, sir." "Do you understand?" Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "You understand nothing. You are an employee, a cleaner. You have no qualification to make decisions about my daughter's mental health. You have no degree. You have no authority. You exist only to clean. Is that what you do?" "Yes, sir." "Then from now on you will avoid that room. Completely. I will hire someone else to clean it. You will work only in the common areas. And if I find out that you attempted any contact with Sophie again, you will be terminated. Without notice, without references. You will leave that house as you came, as a nobody." He swiveled his chair. His body was now turned away from Evelyn. "You may go." Evelyn walked out of that office, went down that building. But she carried with her the image of Sophie with the paper bird in her hand. She carried with her that look of a child who had finally found something that felt like care. And while she waited for the bus on the street, Evelyn made a silent promise. A promise that would violate everything she had agreed to. A promise that would lead her to defy a man who had the money and power to completely destroy what was left of her life. She was going back to that room. There are ways to love that leave no footprints. Evelyn learned this in the days following the confrontation in the office. Sophie woke up early, very early, at 6 in the morning, when the sun was still an orange promise on the horizon, and the entire city still slept. Evelyn arrived at 7, when most of the mansion staff were still having coffee in the kitchen. She went up the stairs carefully, like someone walking on a glass floor. The camera above Sophie's door was still there, its dark glass eye pointed toward the hallway. But Evelyn didn't go into the room anymore. Instead, she walked to the back garden. The garden where Richard had rare plants kept in a greenhouse environment, cataloged and supervised. Flowers of an almost obscene beauty, tended by a hired gardener who had instructions to remove any imperfect leaf. Evelyn picked a single flower, a white orchid with purple markings in the center, small, fragile, clearly out of place in her old working woman hands. She didn't enter Sophie's room. She simply placed the flower in the vase she had left empty in the hallway, right in front of the large window that looked into the bedroom. In the morning, when Richard watched from his office tablet, he would see a vase with a flower. Nothing illegal, nothing that violated instructions, just a vase. Sophie saw the flower when she woke up. Her pupils dilated. She got out of bed, that careful movement of someone who had learned her body was too fragile for haste, and approached the vase. Her nose touched the glass. Her fingers pressed against the cold surface, trying to reach something that was so close and yet so far. Richard, on the tablet screen, saw the movement. He saw the interest. He saw the hope returning to those gray eyes. His hand moved to the phone, then stopped. Because technically putting a flower in the hallway wasn't breaking the instructions. It was just contiguity, proximity. Everything he hated about normal human contact. On the second day, Evelyn found a window pane that had fogged up during the night. Accumulated humidity. She could have wiped it with a cloth, leaving everything crystal clear again. But instead, she used her finger and drew something on the foggy surface. A heart. Simple, crude, almost abstract. When Sophie woke up, she saw it. Her finger followed the drawing on the glass. Her face lit up in a way it hadn't done in months, maybe years. Richard saw everything, through the camera in Benny's eye, through the camera above the door, through the camera he had installed on the window glass in case of escape attempts, as if an 8-year-old with severe immunodeficiency were capable of escaping through a second-floor window. His entire body stiffened. His fingers gripped the tablet so hard the device emitted a vibration alert. Sophie got closer to the glass, her small finger pressed against the pane, trying to mirror the heart Evelyn had drawn. She breathed deeply, as if she were absorbing something through that surface, as if affection could be inhaled like oxygen. Richard got up from the sofa where he was working and went to his desk. He typed a message to his assistant. The reply came in seconds. Evelyn would arrive in an hour. The confrontation was different this time, less theatrical, more dangerous. Evelyn was finishing cleaning the foyer when Richard appeared, descending the stairs deliberately. He wasn't in his business suits. He was in gray workout gear, looking as if he had just come from a squash session. His hair was messy. There was something almost animalistic in his approach. "You're putting on a show," he said, his voice low. Evelyn kept cleaning. Flowers, drawings. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can skirt my instructions with this pathetic game of emotional proximity? Sir, You just nothing. You are an employee. You were explicitly instructed not to interact with my daughter. And here you are, trying to create a relationship, an emotional bond that my daughter doesn't need. A bond that harms her." Richard walked around Evelyn, like a predator. "Do you know what the problem is with people like you, Evelyn? You come from a world where affection is free, where you kiss a child on the head because you feel like it, where you say, 'I love you,' as if it were medicine. But that doesn't work with Sophie. Sophie needs structure, she needs logic. She needs to know that every gesture has a purpose, that every emotion is controlled, that nothing in her life is accidental or random." Evelyn still didn't look at him. "I built a life for my daughter where everything is predictable, where everything is safe, where the only variable that matters is her health. And you, in your ridiculous maternal impulse, are trying to contaminate that with messy, unscientific feelings." He stepped closer to Evelyn. His face was now 12 inches from hers. "Stop pretending you love her. Stop pretending you care, because the truth is you came here to earn minimum wage, and nothing more. If you can manage not to forget that, you keep this job. If you can't, you leave, and no one else will hire you in this entire state, because I will ensure you are branded as an incompetent and deceitful employee. Is that clear?" "Clear, sir," Evelyn replied, her voice almost inaudible. In the days that followed, Evelyn returned to invisibility. It was what she had learned to do best over the course of her life. She entered rooms and left like a ghost. She cleaned surfaces without leaving any mark of her presence other than the absence of dust. She picked no flowers. She drew no hearts. She whispered no lullabies while she worked. She just cleaned. Sophie noticed. Her shine dimmed, not dramatically, subtly, like a light bulb slowly being dimmed. She went back to spending hours lying in bed, stroking Benny, staring out the window. The eyes that had started to sparkle returned to their previous emptiness. Richard tracked everything through the camera. He saw his daughter's regression and it satisfied him. Because it meant control had been restored. It meant he had won. It meant no one could get close to Sophie without his explicit permission. That she was completely his. But there was something he hadn't considered. Something no camera could completely capture. There was something in the way Sophie looked at the door when Evelyn arrived, even if Evelyn didn't enter the room. There was something in the way she touched the window glass, waiting for a drawing that never came. There was something in the way Benny had become even more attached to her face, as if the teddy bear were now her only safe harbor against a world that had promised care and snatched it away. One afternoon, when Richard was in an important conference at the office and couldn't monitor the tablet constantly, something happened. Sophie screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was the scream of a child who had finally understood the depth of her loneliness. A scream that traveled through the entire mansion and reached the hallway where Evelyn was cleaning. And Evelyn, hearing that sound, made a choice that would change everything. The question came in a whisper so low Evelyn almost didn't hear it. My bear. Does he see me? Sophie was sitting on the edge of the bed, her tiny body curled up under one of the Egyptian cotton sheets. Her eyes were fixed on Benny, whom she held against her chest with one hand. The other hand pointed discreetly to the toy's glass eyes. Evelyn continued folding towels. Her hands didn't shake. Her expression didn't change. But internally, something inside her understood she had reached a point of no return. Yes, she replied very quietly, without looking directly at Sophie. He sees. Sophie took a deep breath. That breath of someone who finally confirmed what she had already suspected for a long time. The teddy bear wasn't just a companion. He was an informant. He was her father's eyes watching every movement, every expression, every tear she shed when she believed she was alone. Does he hear too? Asked Sophie. Evelyn didn't answer verbally. She just gave a very slight nod. Sophie lowered her face. When she raised it again, her eyes had a different quality, as if she had just aged years in seconds. The next day, while cleaning the hallway, Evelyn began talking to Benny. Not to Sophie, to the bear, to the camera, to Richard, wherever he was. "Good morning, Benny," she said, as she wiped a cloth over the window glass. "Beautiful day today, isn't it? The sun is quite warm. Unfortunately, in here we don't feel much. Everything is very refrigerated, very controlled." She paused between sentences, as if expecting the bear to answer. "You know, Benny, when I was young, my daughter had a bear similar to you. His name was Thomas. He was brown, too. She slept hugging him every night. Once she lost him in a park. She cried for 3 days." Evelyn dusted a shelf. "But do you know what happened? She learned that some things we lose don't come back, that life goes on, and that sometimes we need to let go of things in order to grow, Benny. Do you understand?" She knew Richard was listening. She knew every word was being recorded. And she knew he wouldn't be able to prove she was talking to Sophie because she wasn't. She was talking to a bear, to a toy. What was the crime in chatting with an inanimate object while cleaning her employer's house? Richard heard every word. He was in his office on a video conference with investors from Hong Kong when he received the audio notification. His assistant had sent it. He excused himself from the meeting, saying he had an emergency, and put on his headphones. Evelyn's voice filled his ears. That old woman talking to a bear. That old woman, indirectly, challenging him. Because he knew. And she knew he knew. And both knew that Sophie knew. His jaw clenched so hard he felt a pop in his teeth. Richard opened the camera app. Accessed the live feed of Sophie's room. The girl was lying down, pretending not to listen, but her fingers were trembling. She was listening to every word of Evelyn's. She was understanding slowly that there was someone in the house who was, somehow, her ally. This could not continue. Richard called a specialized technician, the same one who had installed the first system. A week later, there was a new device inside Benny, a state-of-the-art audio recorder, not just to capture words, to capture tone, breathing, emotion, everything. He summoned Evelyn to his office again. "What are you doing?" he asked, pointing to the transcript of her conversations with the bear printed in a leather folder. "Cleaning, sir." "You are communicating with my daughter through the bear. Do you think I'm blind? That I'm stupid?" "Sir, I'm just talking while I work. Many people do that. Many people are not under surveillance. Many people didn't sign a contract that explicitly forbids emotional contact with the child." Richard opened a drawer and pulled out papers. "I'm going to be very clear. From now on, you will no longer look directly at Sophie. Not in the eyes. If she speaks to you, you do not answer. And this pathetic conversation with the bear, it stops, immediately, or you leave." "Yes, sir. Another thing. I am installing an enhanced recorder, so if you try to skirt my instructions again, I will have enough evidence to file a lawsuit against you for complicity in child emotional negligence. Do you understand the legal implications of that?" Evelyn understood. She understood that Richard had crossed from paranoia into psychosis. She understood that he was creating increasingly impossible rules so he could have a justifiable reason to fire her. And she understood that no matter what she did, he would discard her soon. 3:30 of the night, everything fell apart. Richard was in San Francisco at a 5-star hotel, in a meeting that ran until 11 at night. Evelyn was preparing the last items to leave when she heard the sound. A cough, then another and another. But it wasn't a normal cough. It was that kind of sound that comes from deep in the chest, sounding like someone trying to expel water from their lungs. It was the sound of someone suffocating. Evelyn froze in the hallway, her ears focused completely on that sound coming from Sophie's room. The girl was having a crisis. That type of crisis which, in a child with her immune condition, could mean the collapse of her entire respiratory system. The protocol was clear. Call the private nurse who slept in the third-floor suite. Call the doctor on call. Follow the established hierarchy. Evelyn ran to the phone, dialed the nurse's number. Busy signal. Dialed again. Busy. A third time. Busy. The coughing continued. Stronger now. Desperate. Evelyn ran to the door of Sophie's room. It was locked. Richard had locked the door remotely when Sophie was born with the condition. For protection. For contamination control. "Sophie?" Evelyn called, knocking on the door. "Sophie, are you okay?" "She is fine," said a voice over the internal intercom. It was Richard from the hotel in San Francisco, watching via the monitoring app. "She is having a normal cough. Nothing abnormal." "Sir, she needs help." "She does not need your help. The nurse has already been notified. Leave the child alone." The coughing continued. Evelyn stood still in the hallway listening. That sound of childhood desperation. That sound of a child who was alone in a locked room, unable to breathe, with no one to hold her. "Sir, please let me in. She's suffocating." "The nurse is coming. Get back to work." But the nurse didn't arrive. Evelyn could hear Sophie getting weaker, the sound of the cough changing tone, from desperate to resigned, as if the child understood slowly that no one was going to help her. Evelyn looked at the camera in the hallway, looked it right in the eye, and then, with deliberation, placed her hand on the doorknob. "If you enter that room, you are fired," Richard said over the intercom. Evelyn took a deep breath. She thought of Bella. She thought of all the times she had wished someone would walk through a closed door to save her. She thought of 52 years of obedience, and then she opened the door. Sophie was on the bed, her small body convulsing with the cough. Her eyes were closed. Her skin had a bluish tint that wasn't normal. Benny had fallen off the bed and was on the floor. Evelyn ran, scooped Sophie into her arms. The girl was light as paper, almost immaterial, as if she were already dissolving. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here. You're safe." The coughing continued. But now there was something in that embrace. There was human warmth. There was presence. There was love. And Richard, watching on his phone in that hotel room in San Francisco, saw everything. He saw the moment his daughter nestled against Evelyn. He saw the moment his authority was completely violated. He saw the moment he lost control. And in that second, as he watched through the camera, something changed in his face. Not remorse. Never remorse. But rather a realization that terrified him. He had built a prison so perfect that even he was trapped inside it. The nurse arrived 15 minutes later. She found the door to Sophie's room open. She found Evelyn sitting on the bed with the girl in her arms, still coughing but breathing. The teddy bear had fallen to the floor. The nurse, a woman in her 40s with a professional expression, opened her mouth to complain. But there was something in the scene that paralyzed her. There was something in the way Sophie clung to Evelyn. In the way Evelyn whispered words that weren't medical, weren't scientific, were just human. "Leave her like this for a few minutes," Evelyn said without looking at the nurse. "She just needs to feel she isn't alone." The nurse left, returned minutes later with an inhaler medication, helped Evelyn administer it, and throughout the entire process, neither of them commented on the obvious violation of the rules that had just occurred. But Evelyn knew. Richard knew. And the camera recorded everything. In the heart of the crisis, while Sophie still coughed against her chest, Evelyn had done something deliberate. She had picked Benny up from the floor. She had looked at that glass eye that contained the camera, and she had held the bear facing her and Sophie, as if presenting the child to her invisible observer. Then she had spoken. "She doesn't need more medicine or cameras. She needs a hug." The words were spoken with a calm that didn't match the anger boiling underneath. A calm coming from someone who had spent a lifetime learning to control her own pain. A calm that was, paradoxically, an act of total defiance. Evelyn opened her arms, and Sophie, that 8-year-old girl who had spent her entire life in emotional quarantine, collapsed. Her small body clung to Evelyn with a strength that seemed to come from a place very deep inside. And then came the crying, not that silent crying Sophie had learned to do when she believed she was alone. That complete, visceral crying of someone finally allowing their pain to be witnessed. "I'm scared," whispered Sophie against Evelyn's chest. "I'm scared of being alone." "You aren't alone," Evelyn replied. "I am here. I'm right here." She stroked Sophie's hair, kissed the top of her head. Did all those simple things a mother does. All those things Richard had tried to eliminate through cameras and protocols and rules. The broadcast continued live on Richard's tablet. On the screen, Sophie dissolved in tears. On the screen, Evelyn offered a lap. On the screen, a hug that contained 565 days of isolation, surveillance, and lack of human touch. Richard was in his hotel suite in San Francisco when he saw everything. He had been in a conversation with his partner about a property acquisition when the notification arrived. Motion detected in child's room. Door opened without authorization. He apologized, opened the app, and watched. At first there was only fury. The fury of a man who watched his authority being dismantled in real time. The fury of someone who had built a system of control so perfect that any deviation felt like a personal apocalypse. But then, something changed in the image. Sophie lifted her head. Her eyes were closed, but her face was wet with tears. And for a moment, just a moment, Richard saw his daughter. Not the fragile child who needed protection, not the project that needed to be managed, but Sophie, his daughter, who was a complete human being with needs no camera could satisfy. And he saw Evelyn too. That woman he had tried to erase from his daughter's existence. That woman he had threatened, humiliated, instructed to be invisible. This woman was doing what he should have been doing. She was being the mother Sophie didn't have. The tablet slipped from his hands. It hit the floor of the hotel suite. The screen continued showing the image of Sophie and Evelyn, continued broadcasting, but Richard could no longer see. His eyes were closed. His body had collapsed onto the velvet bed of the five-star suite. The sound that came out of him wasn't a breath. It was a sob. And then another. And then another. As if someone had opened a floodgate inside him, and all that coldness, all that control, all that arrogance was overflowing in the form of tears. He wept. Richard, the man who had spent 52 years teaching himself to feel nothing, was having a complete emotional breakdown. His entire body convulsed. His face, which had always been a mask of control, was now just a bruised, aged, destroyed face. Because finally, looking through that camera he had installed to protect his daughter, Richard understood what he had done. He understood that the prison he had built wasn't to protect her from germs and bacteria. It was to protect himself from having to feel the responsibility of love. And he understood too that he had lost, not control. He had already lost control. He had lost the opportunity. He had lost the years. He had lost the possibility of his daughter loving him. So, at the mansion in Connecticut, Evelyn stayed with Sophie. The girl had finally fallen asleep, her tiny body surrendering to exhaustion. Evelyn laid her on the bed with care, covering her with the sheet. She picked Benny up from the floor and placed him next to Sophie. She knew she had been fired. She knew Richard would have legal grounds to sue her, to ruin her, to discard her completely. She had violated explicit instructions. She had touched the child. She had hugged her. She had offered something Richard had explicitly forbidden, affection. But when she looked at Sophie sleeping, her face finally at peace, Evelyn understood she had done the right thing. That sometimes disobedience is an act of love, that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to preserve humanity. She walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned and looked directly at the camera one last time, raised her hand in a gesture that was farewell and also accusation, a gesture that said, "Did you see? Did you finally see?" And then she left the room. In the hallway, she heard the sound of the intercom. She expected to hear Richard's voice ordering her immediate departure, expected to hear the fury that had marked all their previous encounters. But there was nothing, only silence. And in that silence, Evelyn understood that something had broken inside the man on the other side of the camera, something that would not be put back together the same way. She went down the stairs, picked up her purse, and waited to see what Richard would do now. Richard returned to the mansion the next morning. He didn't call anyone from the airport. He drove himself, that black car with tinted windows that had transported so much fury and so much control over the years. Parked in the garage, went up the stairs. He found Evelyn in the second-floor hallway, carrying a small suitcase. She was leaving. Her eyes were red too, but for the opposite reason to his. She had cried from exhaustion, not revelation. The two stared at each other in silence. Richard had puffy eyes, disheveled hair. He was wearing the travel clothes he had put on at the hotel, wrinkled now, as if he had slept in them, which he probably had. Evelyn said nothing, just watched him, as if she were really seeing him for the first time. Not as the powerful man, not as the villain, just as a broken man. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The words wouldn't come out, and then, very slowly, he made a gesture, a nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an articulated thank you. It was just the acknowledgement that she had told the truth, and that he, finally, had understood. Evelyn went down the stairs, but she didn't leave the house. She just waited in the living room, that empty space where no one ever really sat. Richard went up to Sophie's room. The girl was awake, lying in bed, holding Benny against her chest. When she saw her father, her entire body stiffened. The fear returned to her eyes. Because Richard was still that man who had taught her to be afraid. He walked to the bed very slowly, and then, with a deliberation that seemed to cost him every ounce of strength he possessed, he sat on the edge. His body was rigid. His movements were those of someone who had never done that before, because he never had. "Hi, Sophie," he said, his voice almost inaudible. Sophie didn't answer, just watched him. I turned off the cameras, all of them. He held out his hand. There was something in it, a small key, the key to the surveillance system. Richard placed it in Sophie's hand. Benny won't watch you anymore. No one will watch you anymore. Only you yourself, okay? Sophie looked at the key, then at her father, and then, very slowly, she asked, "Will you come in?" They were just 4 words, but they contained a much bigger question. Will you be here? Will you try? Will you love me? Richard took a deep breath, and then he did something he hadn't done in years. He did something clumsy and strange and completely artificial at first. He reached out his arm to Sophie and hugged her. It wasn't a natural hug. His movements were stiff. There was something mechanical in it, as if he were following instructions from a manual. But Sophie, who had learned to recognize the slightest gesture of affection as a miracle, clung to him. And Richard felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He felt the weight of his daughter against his chest. He felt her hair on his face. He felt the reality that he had spent 8 whole years, without really touching his own daughter. A tear ran down his face. He let it fall without trying to hide it. In the next morning, Richard began his work of reparation. Personally, he took the camera out of Benny's eye, deactivated it with his own hands, then the others, the one over the door, the one on the window, the one on the wall. One by one, he neutralized them as if he were disarming a bomb he himself had planted. When he finished, he returned Benny to Sophie. Just Benny, just an old, faded bear. No camera, no surveillance, no secret. Sophie hugged him as if she had recovered a piece of herself. In the following days, Richard tried. He tried to sit on Sophie's bed, tried to talk. It was clumsy and often awkward. He didn't know how to talk about things that weren't structure or protection. He didn't know how to play. He didn't know how to just be present without controlling. But he tried. Sophie watched him with a mixture of suspicion and hope. The child had learned that hope was dangerous, but she had also learned through Evelyn that hope was necessary. A week later, Richard called Evelyn to his office. But this time there was no threat in the air. There was only humility, a thing the man had rarely experienced. "You were fired," he said, starting, "because of my fault, because of my mistakes." Evelyn didn't answer. "I want to offer you a new position, official, Sophie's companion, with a salary of $6,000 a month, benefits, health insurance. Respect." Evelyn remained silent. "And," Richard took a deep breath, "I want you to teach me how to do this, how to be present with her without destroying her with my control." For the first time since she had met him, Evelyn saw Richard as he really was. Not a villain, just a man who had learned to love the wrong way, a man who had all the wealth in the world but didn't know how to be poor enough to need someone. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll stay." 3 months later, everything had changed. Sophie's room was no longer an isolation chamber. The walls had been painted a soft blue. There were real plants now, not just lab plants. There were books discarded casually on the bed. There were drawings on the wall that Sophie had made. In the garden, on that spring afternoon, Sophie was playing. Her body was stronger now, still fragile but present, alive. She was holding Benny and introducing him to the flowers, making him talk to them in a way that was completely childish and completely perfect. Evelyn was sitting beside her, laughing. Her face had lines that didn't exist before, lines that came from real work, from a real purpose. She was a mother again in that form that transcends documents and DNA. From the balcony, Richard watched them. The tablet that had been his weapon of control was turned off. It had been turned off for weeks. He had deactivated the entire system. He had personally destroyed that first chip that had brought so much fear. He watched his daughter play, watched her face, finally alive, finally hopeful. And he understood completely the price he had paid for his surveillance. He understood that he had tried to protect her from everything, except the most important thing, from life itself. Richard walked down the stairs, walked through the garden, approached slowly, as if still afraid of breaking something fragile. "Can I sit here?" he asked. Sophie looked at him, and for a moment, the fear returned. But then, something changed in her face. She saw not the man from the tablet. She saw the father who was trying. "Yes," she said, "you can." Richard sat down, didn't try to hug her, didn't try to control the moment, just sat, close but not invasive, present but not suffocating. Sophie handed him Benny. "Benny wants to talk to you," she said. Richard took the bear, felt its weight in his hands, that weight that had represented so much power, so much surveillance, so much lack of love. Now it was just a toy, just a symbol that the past was over. "Hi, Benny," he said, his voice cracking a little. "It's good to be here with you." Sophie laughed. It was a sound Richard had never heard from her before, a sound of a genuinely happy child. And in that moment, sitting in a garden with his daughter, and the woman who had taught both of them what it was to truly love, Richard understood that he had lost everything to gain the only thing that mattered. Evelyn watched him. Her eyes said, "You finally learned." It is revolting to see a child kept prisoner like that, isn't it? If you also believe that children deserve real love, genuine freedom, and true hugs, smash that like button right now to support Sophie and all the children who need to be truly seen. This story taught us that control is never love, that surveillance never replaces presence, and that sometimes we need to break our own rules to save the people we love. If you like emotional stories like this, subscribe to the channel to become part of our family. Because stories about redemption, about the power of genuine affection, about second chances, these stories need to be told. They need to be remembered.